So today is Pentecost Sunday, and you may remember that's when we celebrate the giving of the Holy Spirit to the church. And it was actually a year ago that I preached on this Sunday, and that was the Sunday that we experienced Psalm 150 in some of the different languages of the world. And you may remember Jenny came up and read for us in her language, from the Philippines, and we heard also German, French, and some Spanish. Well, today, as I was looking at the text for Pentecost Sunday, Acts 2, which is the one we're all familiar with, is one of the main readings. But another one is from the Old Testament, and it's the story of the Tower of Babel. And of course, you remember from your Sunday school years, or vacation Bible school, that it was at this event where, rather than people being able to understand multiple languages, there was confusion. And the confusion was actually from God for His purposes. Let's look at the scripture together, and then we will take it a little bit verse by verse. But first, just in its entirety. So this is in Genesis 11. If you have your Bible there. And just to put this in context, we're just a couple of chapters removed from the Great Flood and the events of Noah building the ark and surviving on the waters the 40 days and nights. The ark has landed, the people have disembarked, and some time has passed because we have a large group of people at this point. But they're not that far removed from those events. If you're really familiar with this part of the Bible, or if you want to read later on, you would read chapter 10, and we get one of these long genealogical treatises where we have so-and-so is the son of so-and-so, and it goes on and on. That can be more important than we realize. If you read that, there will sometimes be little footnotes or references as to who did what later on. So you might find that interesting. I did. And it's also helpful to see that in chapter 10, we realize these events happened after chapter 11, where we're looking today. So chapter 11 is was added after the fact to sort of explain how we got where we are. We see this genealogy in chapter 10. So, beginning Genesis 11, chapter 1. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which mortals had built. And the Lord said, "Look, they are one people, and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language there, so that they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. A little side note, Babel is a word for confusion, and it survives even in our language to this day as a word meaning confusion, usually in reference to hearing something that someone says. If you remember the Charlie Brown animated specials, whenever the teacher would talk, it sounded something like and of course the students sit there like they understand everything, but that's actually what's going on in their head. having been on the teacher side of that equation for a while, I see this played out from time to time. So, Babel, confusion. But it also has two words present in it, Bab and El. El is a word for God in the Old Testament, and it also means gateway to God. So, when we start out at the beginning of this chapter, the people are unified. And as I was thinking about that, you know, it was the adversity that they'd been through that really sort of contributed to that. They experienced the flood not in the too distant past. They'd come through that together, and then they had undertaken this journey of migration together. Now think about that. Migrating from one place to another, leaving a place that you had called home, uprooted from your traditions, your community, your family, to go out and find a new place. We, most of us, have not had to live that experience. But we do see it played out on the international stage in various parts of the world, some even here in our own country. So this adversity, this shared experience of getting through it together, had caused them to bond. And think about the things that we've been through as a nation. I mean, I can still remember that September 11, 2001 was a Tuesday. I can still remember that I was eating a bowl of partially frozen fruit that morning as I watched this story unfold on the television screen. And I'll bet that many of you can remember what you were doing that day as well. When we experience a traumatic event, there's a surge of adrenaline that goes with that. And that surge of adrenaline fixes memory, physically, in our minds. And that's why we can often remember right before a traumatic event. Sometimes during the event, we go on such automatic pilot that we may forget. But we can often remember what we were doing, who we were with, where we were, all that sort of thing. And you remember how the nation really came together at that time. Some of the partisan wrangling that we see going on today, that sort of went to the background there for a while. And we sort of felt a unity with each other that I think we've sort of lost in our present day. Or maybe consider what we saw on the news this past week, the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of D-Day. Think about what that must have been like. And you probably knew people, or know people, who were there, or were part of that conflict. And that causes, again, a bonding together of shared experience. Interestingly, I knew some World War II veterans. They didn't want to talk about it. But I think that they shared together that experience of just knowing what it was like for the other person to go through that. Or how about the Great Depression? Most of us are pretty far removed from that at this point in our history. But I grew up with parents who had grown up during that time, and I remember my grandparents talking about those days. I still remember my grandmother. She would take a TV dinner and then wash that foil plate time and time again, and then save it for when she might use it another time. I don't know how many stacks of margarine and butter containers we found when we were going through her things. Because you needed to be frugal and use what you had responsibly and as many times as you could. I've sort of gotten into a bad habit, I guess it's bad. Whenever I dry my hands with a paper towel, I'll just set it over aside to let it dry, and I can use it the next time too.
It's bad.
Well, hey, we start to act more and more the way we were raised and what we saw our parents and grandparents do when we were young. I can remember Grandma talking about it was a good day if you could work for $1 a day at that time. But the shared experience of going through that, of getting by, making do, brings people together in a way that times of prosperity don't always bring us together in that way. So the people here following the flood had been through these times together, and as they made their way into this land of Shinar, which, if you know the Middle East, it's between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and it later became Babylon, the great city that we read about even in the New Testament. And it says, the whole earth had one language and the same words. Now, I love the study of language and words. I think it's fascinating. And whenever I have the privilege of working with international students, especially if they're from China or Korea, a place where the language is drastically different from what we're accustomed to here, it's very interesting to learn just a little bit of their vocabulary. In Chinese, for instance, it not only matters how you pronounce the word, but whether the tone of your voice is going in the right direction. It's sort of a musical language. I can't speak any of it. It took me about 15 minutes just to learn how to say shao, which is rain in Chinese, or sha shui, which is snow. But even now, I'm not convinced that I've got that inflection just right. I would say it back to my students, and then they would kind of smile and shake their head, and I'd think, okay, you're just humoring me. And, you know, language can even be complicated within the language that we speak. For instance, listen to these words: irritated, bothered, disturbed, irked, aggravated, miffed, angered, riled up, on a high horse, on a soapbox. And I'll bet every single one of you knew exactly what those words meant. And some of them, I'm not sure there's even any distinction between the meanings. They're synonymous with each other. But how do you explain to someone who doesn't speak English at all, or maybe speaks just a little bit of English, what it means to be on a high horse? We know what that means. But that's something we'd have to explain in more detail to someone else. Whereas if we just said angered, perhaps that would convey the meaning. But there are certain nuances, aren't there, between one word and the next. I mean, for me to say that I'm bothered by something is different than saying, that really irks me, or I was miffed by that, right? That really irritates me. But aggravates, to me, carries a connotation of even greater, right? So, for the people to understand each other at an even deeper level than the superficial word, they had this shared experience to draw on. We need to remember that as we move forward here. Oh, one other thing about language. Sometimes we hear the word correctly, but we understand it wrongly. This is kind of a hard thing to explain because you have to know the people involved, but let me make an attempt. So, my son-in-law Miles has a brother named Casey, and then a brother named Jarrett. So Jarrett and Casey. Well, David, my son, whom you all know, he has two really good friends named Jarrett and Casey, husband and wife. So the other day, Mickey, my daughter-in-law, David's wife, says something about she hopes there's room for all of them and Jarrett and Casey. Well, I heard Jarrett and Casey as in Miles's brothers, but she was saying Jarrett and Casey, their friends. So I heard the words pretty correctly, but the meaning was not right. So that's another thing, that even when we have the shared experience of being in the same community and the same culture, we can still hear the words, but maybe not have the correct understanding. So the people together, having the same language, the same vocabulary, and of course, along with that, the same way of thinking about things, right? That just kind of goes without even saying. we speak the same language, we have the same vocabulary. That means that our thoughts all kind of run along the same track. We know what we mean when we say certain things. And the people had this desire to stay together. We'll look more at that in a minute. But as we think about that, the people staying together, I think that mostly we would think of that as a positive thing, right? That for people to be together, having a common purpose, being united, maybe it would sound something like this: to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, to reaffirm the dignity and worth of the human person, to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. These are all from the preamble to the Charter of the United Nations. Noble aspirations, right? When we think of human unity, that's probably where our minds go. We think of it as a good thing. But maybe God sees something else. Dougie, do we have these pictures? So do you recognize this, or can you see what we have here? Here's a good example of human unity. Everybody thinking the same thing, cheering the same cheer, praising the same ideals. It's a picture of a Nazi rally in Germany. Can we have the next one, please? Here's another picture. Maybe it's a little bit easier to see. Now, in my looking for these images, I came across this next one too. Let's have this one. Look closely. I don't know if you can see it. The guy that's in the center of that big oval, that's George Washington. This is a Nazi rally that took place in Madison Square Garden in February of 1939. I never knew it happened. I had never heard anything about this. We don't know our history. We might be doomed to repeat it. I was shocked. I had no idea that anything like this had ever happened. If we could read the banners, and I don't think we can see those, but one of the banners hanging above the crowd, I think it's the one to the right as we're looking at the picture, says something about Jews will not replace American Christians. Something along those lines. Think about that for a moment. Here's an assembly of thousands of people in the United States of America.
Hey, Ron.
Yes.
It says stop Jewish denomination of Christian America.
Stop Jewish domination.
Domination of Christian America.
Of Christian America. Stop Jewish domination of Christian America. Now, I don't know about you, but I just sort of got sick to my stomach when I learned this. I had no idea. This is 1939, so not even 100 years ago, right here in our own country. Maybe this is what God also sees when human beings get together with uniformity of purpose, language, and thought. Well, as we saw earlier, you can dismiss that awful picture now, thank you. Following the flood, the people began to migrate. They made their way into this region. And there they said, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And so they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And by this point in the story, I'm noticing there isn't any leader that's mentioned. This whole process appears to be very democratic, doesn't it? The people are working together, they're discussing together, they've arrived at a consensus and a plan of action. And since stone is scarce in that region, they had to make the materials that they were going to build with. And so they say, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, otherwise we shall be scattered abroad on the face of the earth. So they had three things that they wanted to accomplish, right? Build a city. The city also had a tower in it. And then they wanted to make a name for themselves. So they were establishing a national identity, they were establishing a city, the city would have a tower. And all of these three objectives were for what purpose? To avoid being dispersed abroad over the whole earth. But what was it that God had told the survivors of the flood? Back in chapter 9 you find out. Be fruitful, multiply, and populate the earth. This was not what God had in mind. He wanted people to spread throughout the earth. And it was that purpose that was going to be the caretaking of creation. So he didn't want this congregation of people all thinking the same thing, speaking the same language, all in one place. For his design for the planet to be what he wanted, he needed us, the people, to scatter abroad and care for the earth. It's interesting, isn't it? The text says the Lord came down. So even though the people thought that they could build this tower with its top reaching into the heavens, even if they had succeeded in getting the tower completely built, the Lord would still need to come down in order to be there. And isn't that the story of God in his dealings with us all the way into the present age? The Lord comes down to us. We did not come to him by sacrifice, following the law, and so forth. He came to us in the person of Jesus. And that is what sets Christianity apart from so many other forms of religious thought. God comes to us in grace, sometimes in judgment. And that's what happens here. And so the Lord, conversing with himself, look, they are one people and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. What a commentary on the possibility of human potential. Nothing will be impossible for them. That's what God says. And again, I think that this can be a good thing, but here it was in the service of a goal that was contrary to the will of God. And so he steps in. Let us go down and confuse their language so that they will not understand one another's speech. And whether this multiplicity of languages happened in an instant or over a period of time, the text doesn't say. Because that's not really the point here, is it? The point is that God confounded their unity so that they would scatter. I wonder how they felt. They had survived the flood, or their parents, grandparents had survived the flood. They had made this journey. They had decided they were going to do something in the interest of all of them together in building this city. And now all of a sudden, that has to be abandoned because they can no longer communicate. There had to be some disappointment. There had to be some fear, certainly. But this was the very thing that God required in order to accomplish his purpose. So the lesson for us then is to see the momentary fear, the momentary disappointment may very well be serving the greater purposes of God. There is a unity among human beings that can be contrary to the will of God. It's this uniformity that wants everybody to speak the same language, that wants everybody to think about things the same way. What's on the great seal of the United States? Do you remember? It's not "In God We Trust." Nothing wrong with that, but it's not on the great seal. The great seal says "E pluribus unum," which means, anybody know? Out of many, one. So there is a certain plurality of diverse people that is a good thing, but it does not go contrary to the will of God. So that's where we have to be careful. Another takeaway from this text, I think, is that Babel doesn't have to be a place, and it doesn't have to be a tower. The city and the tower and the making a name for themselves, those were the three things that the people thought they would do in order to not be scattered abroad. That was their goals. So, city, tower, making a name. There's an element of pride in the making a name. Again, we can even see scriptural references to this because King David made a name for himself. Same language is used there, and it's not meant in a bad way. So none of these things are necessarily bad in and of themselves. The question is, do they serve the purpose of God, or are they against his purposes? That's where we need to be mindful. You know, I wonder if we see some of the same kind of fear that motivated these folks back here at this time. I wonder if we see some of that same fear when we see people be so afraid of people from other cultures or languages coming into our country. If you've ever been to a place like New York City, after we came back from New York, I said, I have never smelled so many different smells or heard so many different languages all spoken in just a small period of time or a small space. And I think you know what I'm saying. I mean, you're walking along, you hear a bit of Russian, you hear some German, you hear languages you don't know what they are. It's incredible. And maybe you've had this experience, that you go to the store, or go to the doctor's office. I was sitting with Becca at the doctor's office this last week, and a couple of ladies were sitting there conversing with each other in Spanish. I didn't think anything of it. But I have in the past. You think, what are they saying? Why can't they speak English? We all speak English around here. Why can't they? Put yourself where they are. How would you feel if you spoke a little German and you were visiting Germany and you were there with some friends? Wouldn't you speak English to one another? Or would you try to speak German to one another because that's what the language of the area was? You see where I'm going, folks? I think we have to guard our hearts a little bit and be careful that we don't become motivated by the same kind of fear that motivated these people to build this tower in this city. I'm wondering if the tower might turn into a wall in some ways of thinking. And I'm not going any farther down that road. I just want us to, as a people, I'm not talking about us so much right here, but us as a people, to just watch the inner heart a little bit and think, what's God's will in this? Both in how I should respond to these needs that I see and what he may be attempting to do in our bigger community. And then the last thought I'll leave you with is the confusion of the moment may lead to the flourishing of blessing later on. We saw earlier, when these folks realized they couldn't speak the same language anymore, they couldn't understand each other, there had to be fear and disappointment because what they had set out to accomplish just wasn't going to happen. They abandoned it. But later on, looking back, this was the purpose of God, for this diversity to flourish and blossom, for the multiplicity of languages, which then, hundreds of years later, becomes the occasion for a miracle on the day of Pentecost, when not only did they hear their own individual languages being spoken, they had understanding of what was being said. So, those are our thoughts for Pentecost this year. Let's sing our closing hymn. It's the last three verses of the hymn we were singing right before the sermon today.